Max Dickins is our next guest. He's a British comedian, big at the Edinburgh Festival with his one-man show. He writes successful books as well. One was about his Groupon adventures. I suppose we'd call them Grab One adventures or something like that here. When his girlfriend left him once, he went and bought tickets to all sorts of escapades to add flavour to his now sad life, and he ended up becoming an English lord, wrestling alligators and exploring life as a beekeeper. And all those escapades took him out of his rut and worked like a charm. Then Max wrote a book called Improvise, about what comedy improv can teach people who aren't comedians. And we think some comedians are geniuses when they're funny on the spot. But there are techniques and tricks that can be applied to life outside comedy. We'll ask Max about that. But mostly we're going to ask Max about his new book, which has more universal reach, maybe, for millions and millions of men. It's called Billy No Mates, How I Realised Men Have a Friendship Problem. Hello, Max.
Good to see you, or good to hear you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. We say Neville No Mates in New Zealand. I wonder how you ended up in the UK with Billy No Mates.
Neville No Mates is actually better because it's alliterative. So yeah. We should maybe borrow Neville. I'm regretting the book title already.
Before we get to your story, your premise here, I think, is proven, isn't it? I saw research reported in The Economist, and your book gets quite in-depth about all this as well. I saw research in The Economist that 15% of men have no close friendships at all, a 5-fold increase since 1990. In the UK, a respectable survey found nearly a third of men don't have an actual best mate. And the stats here are pretty alarming too, especially for young people, male and female actually, but let's stick with men. What goes wrong with our friendships, please?
Those stats are really interesting, and actually since the 1970s they've been pretty similar, pretty static, although a lot of people say it's got worse since obviously the COVID pandemic. Men have two main problems with friendship. The first one is this: while they might have some mates, pub mates, work mates, guys they might play sport with, they don't have any close friends, the people they can go to and have those sort of more intimate conversations about some of the things that really matter, certainly compared to women. The second problem men have got with friendship is that as they get older, their friendship circle, their social network shrinks, and it shrinks a lot more than women's of the same age do. So if you look at the data, men in their mid-20s have a bigger social group than women. By the time they get to their mid-40s, that is completely turned on its head.
When you Google, you see there'll be men listening who say, oh, no, I do have close mates. But when you Google getting married, no best man, as you did, it returns 1.5 billion results in English. And that's what got you started on this book. You were getting married.
Yeah, absolutely. So what it was, Jim, I was literally in a jeweller's with a female pal of mine who I brought along because, like most blokes, I literally have no idea about things like rings. So I brought her along, and we went shopping. Then afterwards, we went to the pub, and she said, "So, Max, who are you going to have for best man for your wedding when you propose?" And my mind went completely blank. And I went back home that night. I got a bit of paper out and a pen, and I wrote a list of people I might ask, like men in my life. And I realised most of them, I worked with them, and they'd find it really weird if I said, "Do you want to be my best man?" And then the rest of them were men I maybe hadn't seen in some cases for 2 or 3 years. And I just thought, what is going on? Like, loneliness, friendlessness doesn't look like me, right? It looks like somebody else. It looks like a much older person. I'm pretty outgoing. I'm pretty quick to buy a drink at the bar. This is not meant to have happened. And I just thought, what goes wrong for men like me? Like you said, those stats about, if you Google it, there's tons of us. And I just thought, I'm going to go on a quest to not only find a best man so I can get married, but also work out the answer to that bigger challenge.
And a lot of the humour in the book is when you go on that quest to find a best man. But that phrase jumps out, doesn't it? Loneliness doesn't look like me. So when you started coming up short with the name of a best mate, you couldn't believe it, and you checked your WhatsApp. That's the first thing you did, I think.
Yeah, I checked WhatsApp, I checked my text messages, and I just thought, when's the last time I've been having a conversation with a friend on even on social media like that. And it was a pretty barren landscape. And the thing is, I was busy, right? It wasn't like I was doing nothing. And the kind of archetypal Billy No Mates, I was hanging out with my girlfriend's friends. I was doing family stuff. I was busy with work. And so it didn't feel until I was forced to audit my social life like I really had this problem. And actually, this comes up a lot, I think, for men. Is I've heard this phrase, weekend loneliness. So they're great during the week. They might go to the bar after work, have a few beers. They get to the weekend and they've got no one to hang out with.
Well, there are three main reasons, you say, why men struggle with friendship. They're fairly obvious, I suppose, but we don't always think about them.
Yeah, so in terms of I explored three theories. And the first one, where do you meet your male friends? Almost always, certainly in the UK at least, it's in the pub, right? It involves drinking because that's what we think we're meant to do. We don't like to be the one that chases and does the organising. Why? Because we're not meant to look needy. We need friends. We just got to have that cool pose. We don't tell our friends we like them because maybe we think that's a bit weak. Banter was the big one, though. Banter, that way men relate to each other when they're hanging out. I call it the jazz of casual brutality, taking the mickey. And it's great fun, but it can create this atmosphere where we maybe don't feel we have permission to talk about other stuff. We create this moat around us where people can't get near to us. And this is the first theory then, that the way we perform being guys when we're together maybe gets in the way of the closer friendships. You'd think if it was about how we do being men, that friendships would have got better because, you know, my dad, I think about him, he's a pretty old school guy. I've got way more options about how I go about being a man than he did. And yet my friendships, if anything, are worse. So this got me onto the second theory. So the experts will tell you that actually male and female friendships are just really different. So women's friendships tend to be face-to-face, based around talk. They're quite intense emotionally, a lot of disclosure in that sense. And then male friendships, on the other hand, tend to be side by side. They're about sharing activities, doing stuff together, often in groups. And when you think about that, you think, what happens when you turn the corridor, turn into the road of your 30s? You have less time, right? Because you're busy with work, with your family, or whatever it is. And those male relationships based around sharing activities suddenly get a lot harder. So maybe that's why men struggle with friendship. But then women have time constraints as well, and yet their friendships don't seem to be so affected. And it's because I think they're better at doing the work of friendship. This is often why men outsource their social circle to their wives and girlfriends, because they'll do all the work of knitting it together. Guys don't tend to do that relational work with each other.
Billy No Mates, How I Realised Men Have a Friendship Problem. Max Dickins is talking to us. You know, you talk about gender as performance, roles that we learn that may not be innate, which is interesting because this is in many ways not a blokey book. It's funny, but there's this great underlying sadness to it because of what loneliness does to people. It kills them as well, Max.
Yeah, it does. Loneliness kills. So a lot of the male mental health stats are pretty well known by now. So this is certainly true in the UK. I think it's true more globally as well. But suicide is the biggest killer of men under 45. And if you talk to mental health experts, they'll say that the fact men don't have avenues for the sort of close conversations that maybe women have more access to is a big factor in that. But we also now know that your physical health is really affected by loneliness. In fact, there was a huge study that came out. It's been quoted all over the place that actually not having friends is worse for you than smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being obese or drinking to excess. So loneliness is really one of the most fundamental parts of a healthy life, or an unhealthy life, as it is.
And we judge it as well. We judge loneliness, you say, and that's probably right. We can treat it often like a disease the other person has that we don't want to catch, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about, we've all had the experience, I think, of being at a bus stop or at a train station and a lonely person, often an older lonely person, maybe they start talking to you and there's something uncomfortable about that. You think, Now, this sounds a terrible thing to say, but sometimes we think about lonely people like, what's wrong with them? Why are they lonely? And maybe they're socially gauche, and the whole situation makes us uncomfortable. But I think it's worse for men. So you go back to that masculinity thing, or the performance of it. Men aren't meant to admit that things aren't going well, or that they need other people, or that they have needs, full stop. So I think men are much less likely to talk about loneliness. That's one reason I wanted to write this book, is to actually go, hi guys, I'm what you might call quite a normal bloke, and yet I'm really suffering. We can solve this problem. It's pretty simple to solve, but it starts with us fessing up a little bit and getting it on the dashboard of our life, going, I'm not happy about this. And until you confront that, I don't think you can do anything about it.
We're going to get to how you solved your wedding problem. It's a gender fluid age, and of course we're necessarily generalising, but men tend to let go of the structures in their earlier lives which bound them together more. You've hinted at that. So you've got to get the structures back. And how do you do that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, structures is a great way of putting it, and rituals, routines is another way of putting it, like building the habitats, the spaces. So I spoke to a guy called Dr. Robin Dunbar, who's regarded as the world expert in terms of friendship research and evolutionary anthropologist. And he said, if I could give you one tip, it's join a club, right? It's a structure where you can repeatedly go back to it. It's kind of a closed loop. If you want to build something for your friends, it's got to be something that is pretty similar each time. So like the classic thing is guys that run, I don't know, a poker school every fortnight. I set up a five-a-side soccer league, which I did every couple of weeks, just to, got the guys together and we played, and then we had a drink after. Now that doesn't sound very glamorous or like some huge magic bullet fix, but the fact that it was in the diary just made it so much easier, because we had it regularly. We knew where to show up, and we didn't have to rely on spontaneity. And if you are a guy, then those sorts of shared spaces are important if you want to keep it going.
And we are constrained by society's rituals, aren't we, arguably? I mean, I wouldn't suggest, you talk about this in the book, I wouldn't suggest you and I go for a walk, or that I'd meet you in the mall. Our options are fairly limited.
Yeah, our options are fairly limited. You can't say to a guy, should we go out? Especially a younger guy, maybe it's different if he's a bit older. You can't say to a guy, should we go out for dinner? You've got to say, hey, should we meet up and have a drink? And then while you're having a drink, you might, if you're hungry, you might say, should we go and grab some food? It's never you'll meet for a dinner itself. I mean, there are lots of rules we impose on ourselves, and I think we can just push back on it a little bit. A lot of people had told me when I was researching the book, they told me, look, I really struggle because I don't want to do friendships based around drinking anymore. And there aren't that many options for guys. So one of the things I did was I went to visit a men's group, which is just a group of guys that come together every week. And they said it was one of the few places they could go where there wasn't booze involved and there wasn't competition. And so many male spaces are not based around alcohol. They're based around competing. And those two things are not bad in themselves. It's just the sort of conversations you're going to have there are necessarily limited.
Billy No Mates is the book. Do men put a brown cover over the front of it when they're reading it on public transport, do you think?
Do you know what? That was my biggest fear, Jim. I had a friend who said they were reading it the other day, and they kept on showing the cover around the train, they said, to try and reduce that stigma. But if anything, I don't know if it works. I have to report back on that.
I notice in the comments attached to the 1.5 billion chaps getting married with no best men, these men were hardly hermits and loners. They were just head-scratchingly without best mates. So why do many men get into relationships and leave the social life itinerary to their partners, I wonder?
I think it's to do with the fact that we're not brought up to do it. Like in my family, when I grew up, my mum did all the family organising stuff. She'd be the one booking the holidays. She'd be the one always ringing up aunties and aunts, checking, uncles and aunts, I should say, checking they're all right. That sort of work of holding a family, holding a group together, we lean on women to do that. And I think when we get into relationships, we just transfer that behavior over that, what's might be referred to as that emotional labor. It's something I really reflected on in my own relationship, where a lot of my friends were my girlfriend's friends. And I thought, I've not done anything to build this social group. And then if you think about that sort of free riding, when two men stare at each other across the ether, waiting for the other one to make the first move, waiting for the other one to send that kind of happy birthday card or whatever it may be, it doesn't happen. So no wonder it drifts and slowly decays. We associate emotional disclosure with, I think, with being feminine. And when we bring kids up, when I was brought up, emotional displays were often subtly stigmatized, be it by teachers or whoever it may be. I think it's getting more liberal now in most places. But then you say, is it more innate? So this is something else I looked into. Is actually visible cross-culturally. It's also visible from quite an early age, which suggests that it can't all be to do with this culture stuff. And another controversial point, so I mentioned Dr. Robin Dunbar earlier. There's research around a skill known as mentalizing. So mentalizing, to keep it super simple, is the kind of the absolute nub of social skill. It's reading the room. It's you come in and say something and I can understand your mindset, how you're feeling, so I can respond appropriately. And they can measure it in certain experiments, and women outperform men in those mentalizing tasks consistently all the time, often by quite a lot. So that, Robin Dunbar argued, was one reason why women can maintain more close friendships, is they literally have better software.
And it would seem to be changing. Men seem to be opening up a lot more and to talk about their mental frailties and so on. What isn't shifting is the loneliness. Those stats are still stubborn, and that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think this is then points at a couple of other things which are linked together. In a sense, the fact that men are reporting not having many friends is actually a good thing. And you might think, well, how could it possibly be good? And if you look at the research, men are spending a lot more time with their wives and their partners because we now marry people we love and our relationships are stronger. So that's, in a sense, a real positive thing. We have less time for our friends because we're spending more time with our spouse. And we're spending more time with our kids because men are investing more in fatherhood, and that's a positive as well. And these are averages, admittedly. I know that's not true of everyone. The connected thing here is that, is the modern world just not friendly to friendship? So if you think about a lot of the changes that have happened, I know this is true in a lot of the Western world, that we're working longer hours. We're often living further away from where we work and from where we socialize. And we're spending a lot more time online, a lot more time consuming content on Netflix and platforms like that. So the space where friendship can live is getting smaller. So I think that is intimately connected to one reason why these things aren't changing.
Yeah. What happened when you tried the website Rent a Friend? And what is that website anyway?
Right. Rent a Friend is bonkers. If you can, it's global, so you can look at it. If you go to rentafriend.com, it's kind of what it sounds like. You can pay someone to be your friend for the hour or half day or day, and you pay them by the hour. The only rule is you've got to pay for everything, and you give them the money in cash at the end. And so I rented someone and had quite a good day. The good thing about renting friends, by the way, despite the fact it's quite embarrassing, is you can do whatever you want. There's no compromise. So if you're the sort of person who hates having to discuss what restaurant you should go to with your friends, paying someone to be your friend is a good solution to that, although a pricey one. It's interesting because Rent a Friend I kind of went on because I spoke to loads of people who rent themselves out as friends, both men and women, on that website. And all of them were being rented by men. Women weren't renting friends ever. And I thought it was really interesting. And I thought even the fact that rentafriend.com exists is like a real sign of something bad in the modern world that firstly, there's a market for it, and secondly, that there's any sort of demand. It says quite a lot about how we live now.
It does. Max Dickins talking to us. Billy No Mates, How I Realised Men Have a Friendship Problem. Anyway, what did you do about a best man in the end?
I spent a whole year trying a load of stuff, being a different sort of person, becoming a better man. And then at the end, I had to choose a best man. And I had way more choice. When I revisited my list and I wrote it up again, it was busy and it was full of people I'd be very happy to ask to be my best man. But in the end, I thought, what is the best man thing? Why do we have one? And it's really to tick a box. And I thought, I want to have some best friends up there with me when I get married at the top of that aisle, but I don't just need to do what everyone else does. And I reflected that actually my two best friends were women, and that's absolutely fine. So they were my best women when I got married, but I had 3 groomsmen as well who were amazing. And some people I say that to maybe get a bit deflated and go, hang on, you've spent ages trying to find a best man. And I say, well, no, actually I didn't. I spent ages trying to have much better friendships with the men in my life. And that was a success. And at the end, the wedding was as well. It was just not a man stood there holding the ring.
You say this, and I heard someone say it to me once, to have friends, you have to be a friend, which, as you describe, it sounds good. It isn't that easy, though.
No, it's not easy. But then I would say we've maybe come to think of everything in the modern world as something that should be convenient and easy. You can't order a friend like you order an Uber. Otherwise, go on rentafriend.com. Like, sometimes it is hard. And I came up with 3 nutshell things that I tried to live by. One was show up when asked, go first when not, keep going even when it's hard. So that go first thing speaks to your point about if you want to have a friend, be a friend. And even when it's hard, you got to still do that, even when it's not super convenient. And look, it is tricky when you get super busy and you have a family and a career and everything else, but it's worth the cost. And that sounds glib, but there isn't a simple answer. I for years thought I could have friends without making any effort. And that's where I ended up, having none.
If you want a best man, you need to be a better man yourself. That's the strapline here, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. You want to be the sort of person that somebody can be a close friend with. I didn't put this in the book, so this is sort of an exclusive. But to try and become a better man, I went to therapy sessions, and for no reason apart from to try and get better at having more intimate conversations. And after about 4 months, and she said to me, the thing is with you, Max, is you can talk about anything in an intellectual way or a funny way, but when other people talk to you, they get a sense that you can't do anything else, that you won't be able to reciprocate if they own up and talk about things in a more personal way. So maybe that's why you've got no friends. And that was like a haymaker. I was on the canvas when I heard that. And being a better man was about facing that and working out different ways of being with the men in my life. And that I think is really gets to that point you made about being a better man to get a best man.
It is interesting to hear that. Well, now that you have married Naomi, in theory you don't need men's friends anymore. She'll be organising your social life for you, but I suspect you're not going to let that happen.
I'm not going to let that happen. I can tell you, guys listening to this, if you write a book about being a better bloke, you are going to be held to that by your spouse relentlessly. So every time I get a bit lazy around the house or I'm a bit rubbish, which obviously I am quite a lot, she'll be like, I think you'll find on page 220, you said, and quote it back to me. So I've dug my own grave here. I'm going to be held to it by my darling wife forever. So I don't think she'll let me off the hook, Jim.
We don't have time really to talk about your previous book, Improvise, about the lessons you can apply in life from improv comedy, from being a comedian. But I quite liked one of the first concepts because it kind of relates to what we've been talking about, the yes and mindset. Would you mind briefly explaining that?
Absolutely. So, I mean, you have embodied the yes and mindset all the way through this interview, Jim. So you're doing it, you're role modeling it. So yes and is how comedians make up scenes in the moment on stage in improv shows. So the yes is accepting what we would call an offer, and then the and is adding to it to build it forward. So you ask me a question, I accept the question, and then I relate to it and connect what I'm going to say to what you've just said. You then hear my answer rather than just going off in a completely different direction and saying what you would have said anyway. You accept that and then you build off it. And that's what helps us stay in relationship, helps us, if we were on stage, create comedy. But actually it's a thing you can use in conversations anywhere. Are you the sort of person that we would say in improv blocks action? So you just ignore what you just heard, or just go, no, that's not it, or just shoot the person down? Or you somebody who accepts what you've been given, suspends judgment, and then tries to work with it? That is what a yes and mindset's all about.
I'm glad I asked. Just before we let you go, you'll have met a few Kiwi comedians or seen them at the Edinburgh Festival, and I think you emailed saying that there are quite a few improv people from our part of the world in the UK generally.
Yeah, it's been great to see so many amazing Kiwi comics over here. I used to be on the stand-up comedy circuit. Jared Christmas, who's a Kiwi, is big on the circuit over here. He's doing Edinburgh and all sorts of amazing things. Rose Matafeo is really famous. I've done some shows with her, actually. She's a wonderful talent. Nick Hampson as well over here is doing stuff at the Soho Theatre in London and his own stand-up shows, as well as starring in Rose Matafeo's amazing Netflix series. So there is a real Kiwi flavour to comedy in the UK at the moment. And it's quite a similar sensibility, I think. And it's really adding loads over here. So we're grateful to have them. Thanks for lending them to us.
Grateful to have you talk about your book, Max. Well done on it. And thanks for your time.
I've loved it. Thanks so much, Jim.